Hello, everyone.
Hi, good morning, Bhavya.
Yes, good morning, sir. So today we have our third session, third webinar in the session of deep engagement. So we would like to thank all our participants for your support and participation in the sessions. So today we have Mr. Yogi Srivastav as a speaker for today's session. So let me briefly introduce Mr. Yogi Srivastav. So Mr. Yogi Srivastav is a general manager in SIC Kanpur Legal Department. By professional, he is a company secretary and qualification. He comes with a vast knowledge of legal and compliances. He has worked with different segments like Vodafone and NRI City in the past and helped more than 100 startups with their legal and compliance issues. He has been a great contributor with policies and legal rights at the Incubation Center. So, in today's session, Yogesh Srivastava will discuss about the company incorporation and legal issues. What are the legal challenges faced by the companies, and what are the compliances and agreements that are important in the legal sector? So it's my humble request to all the participants. If you have any questions or doubts, so you can drop your question in the chat box, or you ask us to means to allow us to allow you to have a interactive session. So now I request Mr. Yogi sir to please start the presentation. Sir, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bhavya. Good morning to everyone, and hope I'm audible to all of you. And it gives me immense and warmth and great pleasure to grace all of your presence in the interest of the entire ecosystem of the startups. So I am Yogi Srivastav, and I'm professionally a company secretary, and I would be happy to discuss about different legal aspects of company incorporation, fundraising, and also the incubation of startups and the challenges which are basically faced by the incubators in the ordinary course of business activities. So, with due respect to the senior members and colleagues of this webinar, I would like to share the PPT, which is a small PPT, and I would like to share that PPT and would like to discuss this further. Thank you so much. Just sharing. These are very basic information, and I am very sure that the professionals and the qualified person who have joined this webinar might be having knowledge about the types of business entities available in India. Generally, we know about it, but this is something very important to discuss this here, because as far as we are talking about the incubation of the different startups, we generally incubate the private limited companies. So this is very important to discuss what are the types of firms, what are the types of business entities that are available that can be incorporated in India, and what are their liabilities. What is the liability of a proprietor of a firm? What are the liabilities of the partners of a partnership firm? And the most important thing is that the perpetuality, the separate legal entity mechanism of partners and the firm. And also, if we talk about private limited entity, then the separate legal entity mechanism for directors and its promoters. So let's start uh, from the partnership firm. So this is uh, the partnership firm are such firms which are very common in India. Any entrepreneur who starts his journey of the business generally starts with the proprietorship firm only. Because why it is important? Because it doesn't require any registration. You can incorporate your business venture just by creating a name, and you can just go to the bank and you can provide your PAN card, the KYC, and the other details, and you get the bank account opened there in in any government or private bank, and you start doing the business activities in the form of a proprietorship firm. And the challenge which a proprietor faces is the unlimited liability. A sole owner, or what is the meaning of a proprietor? Proprietor is a person who's the overall owner of the business entity, who's everything. Like if I start a venture, I would be responsible for everything of the business, whether it is liability, whether it is loss, or it is a profit. So proprietor holds unlimited liability. If in the future business goes into a toss and the business suffers losses and the firm goes into the liquidation, the firm get closed, then the liabilities would be paid off only and only by the proprietor. Proprietor will have to indemnify the losses not only by the assets of the proprietorship firm, but also by selling the personal properties, including movable and immovable properties too. And he has a sole right on the capital. This is something interesting, that he is the sole owner. So he would be taking the decision at his own discretion. There is no involvement of any other person on the decision making process. He has a one-man control over the business activities, and he is completely free to take the decision whether to commence the business activity, whether to close the business activity. So he has a willful commencement and closure right. The other thing is that small size and limited work area. So proprietorship firms are good for those businesses which are having small size business jurisdiction, and the businesses which do not require a large work area generally prefer this proprietorship firm. The other thing is that the no profit sharing. All the profits earned by a proprietorship firm are taken or shared only and only with the proprietor and not with any other person. Minimum legal aspects of formalities. That means that the proprietor is actually not required, apart from the GST and income tax norms, he is basically not required to file different returns with different authorities like registrar of companies. He just needs to provide the basic returns to the income tax department, the TDS department. There is no registrar of companies type of department in the proprietorship firm. And capital is, as far as the fundraising in a proprietorship firm is concerned, the capital in a proprietorship firm is raised from the personal savings and the funds which are basically raised through friends and families and other ordinary financial institutions like banks and all. So I talked about proprietorship firm. So coming to the next point, it is a partnership firm. This is also very common in India, that sometimes a person feels that he has a constraint in fund. So two persons sits together and decides to create a partnership firm. So any person in India can have a partnership firm, and there is no requirement of registering a partnership firm in India. You can incorporate a partnership firm either with or without registration. Please note that I'm not talking about limited liability partnership. That is governed by Companies Act. So that is completely different. Partnership firms, here I'm talking about a normal partnership firm, which are created and constituted by the partners without or with a registration process. So if we talk about members, how many members are there in a partnership firm? So at least two persons are required for a partnership firm. a single person cannot be called as a partner if there is no other person. As far as liabilities are concerned, so if we talk about liabilities, the liabilities of a partner in a partnership firm is unlimited. If firm goes for liquidation or firm gets losses, the partners are personally liable to make good the losses. Their personal properties can be seized off and can be sold off by the creditors if the properties of a partnership firm are not sufficient up to the amount of the loss. As far as the sharing of profit and loss is concerned, it is decided well in advance before creating a where it is decided, agreed of the firm, and that deed provides a constitution of the whole partnership firm, right? So voluntary registration, as I told earlier also, that there is no such need to get the partnership firm registered under Indian Partnership Act 1932. But it is always good to register a partnership firm, because when it comes to a court, unfortunately, I have been experiencing in a partnership firm that when a court asks for some evidence that there was a partnership firm, there was a partnership deed. So if a partnership firm is registered, it gives a conclusive evidence that there was a partnership firm, and there is a conclusive document that provides evidence for a partnership firm. So it is always desirable and it is always good to get the partnership firm registered under the Partnership Act. So if we talk about disadvantages, so there is a lack of continuity. We cannot say that the partnership firm goes for a perpetual period. Sometimes a partnership firm is created, but it is dissolved within a year only, because since it is not regulated by any act, and the act which is currently there in India for partnership firm is very old, that is Partnership Firm 1932, and the liabilities of partners are also unlimited. So it is always a threat before the partners that if anything happens wrong in the business, their personal properties can be sold off. So there is a feel of fear in the business venture if it is in the form of a partnership firm. And contractual regulation between the partners are basically regulated by a partnership deed. So partnership deed is the most important charter document of a partnership deed. As far as the fundraising is concerned, venture capitalists never think comfortable to invest in a partnership firm. So the capital is raised only from the partners and the ordinary financial institution like banks. So hope this partnership firm concept is clear. I have not talked much about that, but these are the basic features of a partnership firm. So coming to the next slide. Feel free to raise any question if you feel that something is very important to discuss. Don't hesitate. I would be very happy to answer any query of the member. So now coming to the limited liability partnership. This limited liability partnership concept is a very new concept. I discussed about the disadvantages of partnership firms. So all those disadvantages are removed off in an LLP. Any partner, means any minimum 2 partners can incorporate a limited liability partnership. And as the name is indicating, limited liability partnership, it means that the liabilities of the partners in a limited liability partnership firm are limited to the amount of the capital contributed by them in a partnership firm. So they don't have unlimited liability concept in the limited liability partnership. If some unfortune happens in this LLP, and if firm goes for liquidation, if the firm suffers losses, those losses would not be indemnified by the personal properties of the partners. So for whom this LLP is good? For the professionals, for advocates, for doctors, for company secretary, chartered accountant, CMAs. It is always desirable to have a limited liability partnerships because there is a lesser burden of the compliance in comparison to the private limited or public limited companies. So if you incorporate a limited liability partnership, you will have lesser cost of compliance here in this LLP. So the less attraction for equity investors. If we talk about fundraising, this LLP, this limited liability partnership firms are such firms are which are basically not liked by the investor, the angel investor, because angel investors invest in such firms where they get something in return. In return, if we talk about, so that return is nothing but equity. Since LLP does not carry equity shares, so they don't prefer in investing in the limited liability partnership firms because they never want to give loan to LLPs, because in loan what they get only the interest on the disbursement of the loans, but in the equity there is a appreciation of the overall capital of an equity over a period of 10 years or 15 years as far as the valuation goes up. So it is a less attraction for the angel investors and the equity investors because they don't get the equity. They never like to invest in LLPs. However, there are the LLPs of big industries like Reliance also has its 13 LLP firms in India, but they don't depend on the investments. That is why they are creating LLPs, because they have sufficient amount of funds, they have sufficient amount of working capital in the entities. Say that is why they don't require investments, and since the liabilities of the partners are limited, and this is the reason that they are coming up with the LLP concept. As far as the statutory audit is concerned, for every private or public limited company, any kind of a company, if it is registered under the Companies Act, there is a requirement of a statutory audit. So even if there is a turnover of, if the turnover is zero in a LLP, in a private limited company or a public limited company, you will have to get the audit, the statutory audit done for your company. So there is a mandate of a statutory audit, but if we talk about LLP, there is no such mandate. So there is a threshold. If that threshold is not reached out, then you don't have to compulsorily get your firm audited by a chartered accountant. So this is something good because they take their fees as a statutory compliance fees, and the compliance fees is reduced by the statutory audit fees. So it is generally cheaper to maintain a LLP in comparison to private limited or a public limited company. But looking forward, the scope in view of the investments coming from different angel investors, it is always advisable to have a private limited company instead of going for a limited liability partnership firms. I would again request my friends and seniors of this webinar that to discuss anything which they want to have and in their mind. And now we would talk about private limited company. Private limited company is a very common and prevailing concept in India. This is something where the directors and the founders get good amount of investments also. So we will talk about what is private limited company. So the most important thing in a private limited company is that it is completely different from its founders and directors. It carries a characteristic of a separate legal entity. So the directors and founders cannot be called the part of the private limited companies. The directors may be called as individuals working for a company. They are not themselves the company. Instead, they would be called as something like, you may say, the employees of a company. So the directors are the first phases. They are themselves not the company. So if anything happens in the company, they would not be uh, personally liable for the losses of a private limited company unless there is some fraud involved in the transactions between a director and a company. So if a private limited company is incorporated, uh, there is a separate legal entity mechanism between a director and a private limited company. Simultaneously, for the founders also, if founders start a venture in the form of a private limited company, they simply subscribe to the equity shares of a private limited company. They simply buy equity shares of a private limited company. So if there is loss in a private limited company goes for liquidation, they would not be responsible to meet the losses from their personal properties. If we talk about the minimum number of directors and the shareholders which are required for a private limited company, it is only two. Any two directors and two shareholders can start a private limited company. But here I would like to share that the directors have to be individual. Any firm or any artificial person cannot be the director of a company. However, if we talk about shareholders, it is not necessary for the shareholders to be individual or to be the human body. Any artificial person created under the laws of India, like a uh, any other private limited company, can also become a shareholder of any other public or private limited company. The other important thing is the minimum paid up share capital requirement. Earlier, before 10 years, there was a requirement of having a minimum paid up share capital of rupees 1 lakh in a private limited company. So that requirement has been omitted by the commencement of the new Companies Act 2013. Now, even if you have 500 rupees, you can infuse your 500 rupees in a private limited company, and you can, start a venture in the form of a private limited company. So there is no such requirement of putting large amount of money in the company. Even if this requirement was there in the beginning, when founders, basically why there was a requirement of putting 1 lakh rupees as a paid up share capital. The requirement was that there was a bond between founders and a private limited company. So when they infuse money, they used to assume that there would be a requirement of minimum 1 lakh as a working capital for the company. So that is why going forward in the future, it was discussed by the finance ministry of the country that this requirement should be omitted, and that is why if you incorporate a private limited company, as of now, there is no such requirement. As far as we talk about the fund for fundraising, it is always an attractive entity for angel investors and venture capitalists because they get equity in exchange, they get equity in return. And why they invest in a startups like a private limited company? Because once they invest in the company, and as far as the company scales up its business activities, gets revenues, uh, reaches up to the break-even point, and then crossing that break-even point and started earning the profits, the capital appreciation happens. Your equity share, which was of rupees only 10, for example, if it was only of rupees 10, and then if it crosses rupees 10,000 per equity share, you can see the huge amount of capital appreciation in a private limited company in comparison to the normal companies which are listed with Bombay Stock Exchange and normal stock exchange, the National Stock Exchange. So it is always a point of attraction for the investors. They invest in the beginning of the business, and once the plant is grown, they diffuse their capital by selling of the venture to the big sharks. Okay, so how it is governed? What is the governing criteria of a private limited company? So there is a board of directors. There is a board called board of directors. So a private limited company is always governed by the directions and the guidance of the board of directors. You may call it as a council of the members who are called as directors. The major decisions are taken by the board of directors. If you see the companies at 2013, there are the list of decisions which are prescribed by the Companies Act. That means that there are the list of the decisions which are actually required to be passed by the board of directors only and not by any single director. If we talk about the decisions to be taken by the board of directors, it means that the decision has to be supported by the majority voting of the board of the company. Now, the next benefit of a private limited company is uninterrupted existence. So it has a perpetual existence. If it is said that a company is registered under the law, and if you want to discontinue your business activity, which is in the form of a private limited company, it is not so easy to discontinue the business. You will have to again apply for liquidating your business venture through NCLT. However, there is a temporary arrangement of striking of your company, but you will have to go to NCLT. You will have to apply the liquidation, and you will have to comply the provisions of the winding of your business activities. It has a capacity to sue and be sued. So since it is treated as a separate legal entity, it can sue any person and it can be sued. It has a borrowing capacity. It can borrow money in its own name. And the other important thing is that the transferability of the shares. The equity shares of a private limited company are transferable. There are some restrictions which I would be discussing in the later slides. Fundraising, I already discussed that it is always an attractive point for the venture capitalists. They prefer investing money in a private limited company or in a public limited company in comparison to LLP or any other form of the business venture. So coming to the next slide. So these are the basic requirement of the incorporation of a private limited company. I don't think that there is a requirement of discussing all these things in detail. Uh, if the directors belong to India, they just need to submit their normal KYC documents, the address proof of the registered office, and there has to be minimum 2 directors and founders. And why I have written initial paid up share capital of rupees 10 means if there are 2 founders, they will have to buy at least 2 equity shares, 1 equity share each by 1 founder. So the minimum face value of our equity share is rupees 10. That means they will have to deploy at least rupees 20. The important thing while registering a private limited company is the drafting of the memorandum of association and articles of the association. This is the most important aspect and the most important document of a private limited company, because memorandum of association covers the overall jurisdiction of a company. What are the objects? What would be the objects of a public limited company or a private limited company? What would be the constitution of the company? How the directors would take the decision? Within how much period the general meetings would be conducted. All these things are basically appended and set forth in the memorandum of association and the articles of association. Though, so earlier there was a time I used to visit a registrar of companies many times. Now the Ministry of Corporate Affairs has made it very easy to incorporate a private limited company. If you submit the documents of a private limited company, your incorporation would get over within a period of 2 days only, sometimes within 24 hours only. So if you submit all the documents as per the checklist required by the MCA, the company would be incorporated in next 24 hours. So it is very easy to get your company incorporated. Now with the introduction of the SPICE e-forms, the GST and EPF registration also these registrations are also possible at the time of company incorporation. So you don't need to wait for the company incorporation. Simultaneously, you can also apply for GST and EPF registration while incorporating a private limited company. So these are some important points which you would have to take in your mind while drafting a memorandum of association of the company. So all the relevant objects, you should first jot down the objects of the company. You should cover in the memorandum of association, because later on, if you want to alter the objects of a MOA, then again there is a requirement of holding a general meeting, getting the resolution passed by the members, and again filing a number of forms with registrar of companies, paying the fees of the professionals and the government fees. So it is always good to have a detailed view of the memorandum of association, discuss with your chartered accountant or company secretary that what are the objects that are going to be there in the memorandum of association. Properly see all these documents, properly check the objects. For example, if your object is manufacturing, then you should check whether it is so whether it covers all the fields of the manufacturing. For example, if you are gonna manufacture some sort of batteries, so there are some ancillary objects also which you should cover in your MOA. The borrowing powers, we have been experiencing that the borrowing powers are regulated by the Companies Act 2013. But what I have experienced, that sometimes if the borrowing powers are not there in the memorandum of association, the lenders never prefer lending money to your company, because they see they want the borrowing powers to be covered in your memorandum of association also. If you say that borrowing powers are by default regulated by the Companies Act 2013, and sir, we have the borrowing powers because we are allowed to have the borrowing powers as per the Companies Act 2013, they don't accept all these things. So it is always advisable to have borrowing powers to be included in the memorandum of association of a company. And the other thing is the provision for the additional director. This is also something which you must discuss with your chartered accountant while incorporating articles of association. Additional director means if you want to appoint any other person as an additional director, generally the directors are appointed in a company with the consent of the board, not only with the consent of the board, but also with the consent of the members. But it is quite difficult for holding two meetings, one meeting for board and the second meeting for the shareholders and the members of the company. So it is always advisable to have this additional director clause in your articles of association. If this clause is there in your articles, you can appoint a director as an additional director, and there would be no requirement for obtaining shareholders permission. The additional director would be acting as additional director up to the conclusion of the annual general meeting, and in the same annual general meeting you can seek for the consent of the shareholders for the regularization of the appointment of the additional director. The other last thing is that the name of the first directors should be clearly mentioned in the memorandum of association of a company. Sometimes it also happens that the names are not specified in the MOA, and when you go to the bank refuses to disburse the funds as loan or overdraft to your company, and they say that things are not clear. Even if you say that MCA is clearly exhibiting the names of the directors of your company, they don't go there, and they want to see the names of the directors in the memorandum of association. So please discuss this with your chartered accountant. And sir, I want the names of the first directors to be mentioned in the memorandum of association. So here are some do's and don'ts. You must see that while signing any document for the incorporation of the company, what are the important things that you should keep in your mind? The first thing is that don't sign the document with closed eyes. Don't trust your professional blindly. Please read all the documents very, very carefully, because ultimately you are going to sign all these documents, and the registrar of companies would accept all these documents as a declaration from your side. You cannot deny, you cannot say that, sir, I was not aware about the legal compliance of the document and I just signed this document with upon the trust on my professional company secretary or a chartered accountant. So you cannot, you will not be in a position to address that that fault which might happen after the incorporation of the company. For example, the second paragraph I have mentioned in the slide is the paid up share capital amount. I have experienced many times that the startup is created with a large amount of the paid up share capital. For example, a friend comes to me and says that uh, he said that I incorporated a company, but because of the fault of the company secretary who was actually responsible for the incorporation of a company, by mistake, he wrote in the spice form that the paid up share capital of a company would be rupees 10 lakhs. And there is a compliance that once the company is incorporated, you will have to deposit that amount in a bank account of the company within 6 months from the date of incorporation of the company. And a return in the form of INC 20A is filed with the registrar. So he was asking for a solution that since the company secretary made a mistake, that I wanted the paid up share capital of the company to be as rupees 10,000, but he wrote as 10 lakhs. What is the solution? I said, there is no such, there is no other solution. Even if you write to MCA saying that I signed this document, mistakenly they are not going to provide you any solution. So he had to deposit 10 lakhs in the bank account, and accordingly INC 20A form was filed with the registrar of company. And if you don't file that INC 20A form with the registrar of company within 6 months, again there is a huge penalty. And it is only after filing INC 20A form with the registrar of companies, the private limited company would be actually able to commence its business activity. You will not be able to take a loan from a bank if this INC 20A form is not filed by the registrar of companies. So please be very careful while filing any ROC document with the registrar of companies for your incorporation of a company. The other thing is that the digital signatures. Please keep a track of the digital signatures. Keep all the digital signatures with yourself only. If your chartered accountant, if your professional asks for your DSC, please ask him to attach the digital signature in front of you only. Do not share the OTP with anyone except with your CA or CS. Once you register your digital signature or you apply for a digital signature, you get an OTP. Please don't share that OTP with any other person except with your professional. And while negotiating the fees of a chartered accountant or a company secretary for a private limited company, please do discuss the pre and post compliance, because your CA or a CS might say that the cost of a private limited company is this, but once you incorporate a company and over a period of 1 year, once you see the involvement of chartered accountant and the requirement of filing of different forms with different ministries and authorities like income tax, labor office, GST, and TDS returns and all, the ROC forms and all. So you should discuss a overall package of handling the compliance of a company, and you should negotiate a good amount of fees with your CA or CS. For a startup, a fees for a private limited company in India, including the statutory audit fees, incorporation of a private limited company, filing different returns, including income tax returns and all, would not exceed 20,000, maximum 25,000 rupees. 25,000 rupees in the first year, and in the next financial year, it would be between 10,000 to 15,000, because this 25,000 rupees fees includes the incorporation fees also. The fraud detection. This is also something very important, that once you incorporate your company, you get a dispatched material from the postal authority saying that all these documents have been dispatched to you. have been sent to you by the MCA department, and you have to pay rupees 1,000 or 2,000 rupees for accepting this document. So please don't accept all these documents, because all the documents are available online. You get the registrar, you get the registration certificate, PAN card, everything you get in electronic form. So please don't accept any sort of these documents. And in the last, uh, which I would be feeling good to discuss in the later slides, is the founders agreement. Once the company is incorporated, it is always good to have a founders agreement. So there is a requirement of first board meeting. I would not go in detail. The first board meeting has to be conducted within 30 days from the incorporation date. In the first board meeting, the important decision like who is going to be the statutory audit of the company, statutory auditor of the company, where the company will open its current account, uh, where the statutory registers would be kept. So the directors also go through the articles and memorandum of association once again, and the company takes a note of the same. So all these things happen in the first board meeting. So here are the compliance checklists. You should ask for this compliance checklist from the professionals, that what are the compliances that a private limited company is going to comply for a financial year. Now, this is important, the definition of a startup and benefits. So here I would be discussing about the aspects of an incubation center's point of view. So rather than discussing it here, I would be going here. Desired eligibility criteria for the company for incubation. So if you have an incubation center, you should first create a eligibility criteria for the entities to be incubated. So what kind of entities that you are gonna incubate in your incubation center? So for example, you may decide that entity has to be a private limited company. So as I told in the earlier slides, that the private limited company does have an equity mechanism. So they can provide equity in return of the services. In lieu of the services, they can provide equity shares, and the equity shares over a period of 5 years or 10 years get appreciated. Their capital value appreciates. So it is always good to have a private limited company. And the other criteria could be have a USP. The business should have its own USP. And if the prototype is not ready, so the incubation center may think whether they are going to provide the incubation services for the entities which have their prototype ready, or they may also think for pre-incubation services to the startups which generally do not have the prototype, and the founders and the entrepreneurs and innovators are working for the development of the prototype. As far as DPIT recognition is concerned, it is not mandatory. So what are the benefits of getting a startup registered under DPIT? You might have heard a word startup. My company is a startup is not a valid statement unless it is registered under DPIT. So what are the benefits? It is mentioned here that you will get a tax exemption under section 80 IAC. It means that once you get funding from the angel investors, you might have heard a concept of angel tax investment. Means you have a share of worth rupees 10 only, and if you sell your equity shares, which is currently at par of rupees 10, if you sell this equity share at rupees 100, that there is a gain of rupees 90. So capital gain on the differential amount, that means the capital tax on the 90 rupees amount, is basically called an angel tax. So if your company is a registered startup under DPIT, you may apply for 80 IAC clause section of the income tax authorities. Once you get this exemption certificate, you will get the tax exemption certificate from the income tax, enabling you to raise the funds without paying any angel tax to the income tax department. So you will not have any fear of paying any tax on the differential amount of the gain of the securities sold, of the shares sold. What are the eligibility criteria for a startup? Is that the turnover should not exceed 100 crores. It has to be a private limited company or a partnership firm or a limited liability partnership firm. So don't surprise seeing a partnership firm there as a startup. Partnership firm and LLP, both entities are capable for getting the startup recognition. But it is always good to have a private limited company as an incubating company of an incubator, because it carries a feature of equity shares. It should not be older than 10 years. That means the age of a startup should not be older than 10 years. And it must carry some innovative business idea and employment generation business. So all these things are, and the last thing is that I'm talking about definition, it has to be registered with Dpit. Only then it would be called as a startup in India. So these are some funding programs that may be undertaken by any incubation center. These are for instances only. It is always advisable to keep on searching from different portals that what are the funding programs going on in India, where the incubation center may apply for fund, because an incubation center is going to financially help the startups incubated with the center. So only mentoring and R&D support are not sufficient unless you provide them some funding support also. So the Nidhi Prayas, Nidhi EIR, and various seed fund programs that are being carried out by DPIT may be applied for. And there are many other funding agencies like Engineers India Limited and other public sector undertakings. They also come up with funding programs for the startups. And since incubation activity is also the part of the permitted expenditure under Schedule 7 of the Companies Act, I'm talking about CSR expenditure. In a very simple language, you may understand that now paying for incubation service is going to be the permitted expenditure for CSR. So many multinational companies and big corporates are also contributing to the success of the startups by investing money to the incubation centers. So if they invest amount to the incubation centers, they get a recognition that they have invested under the CSR norms. There are the detailed norms for CSR in the Companies Act 2013. I would request the members to go through all these norms in detail. So the policies. So if I talk about policies, an incubation center should have all these policies. The incubation policy, this is the most important policies. This policy should be approved by the board of the incubation center. If it is a Section 8 company, the incubation policy should be properly discussed among the members of the board. Or if it is not a Section 8 company, it is being hosted by the institution only, then it may be discussed by the senior members of the incubation center, and it may be approved by the council of the incubation center. So this incubation policy creates a constitution that how the companies would be, incorporate, how the companies would be incubated, what would be the eligibility criteria. You can put some additional eligibility criteria for the incubation of the startups. If the faculties of a host institution are willing to incorporate their own companies for some good project, so how would you incorporate and incubate those companies in your incubation center? All these things may be governed in the incubation policies. What would be the process, call for invitation, cohort creation, and who would be the members of the external investment committees who would be evaluating the applications of the startups applied for incubation in the incubation centers. All these things would be discussed and arrested in the policies, in the incubation policy. What would be the period of the incubation? So these are the general terms that may be captured in the incubation policies. The seed fund disbursement policy. This is also very important policy. Once a startup is incubated with the incubation center, the incubation center gets money from different funding agencies under different funding programs. So you will have to decide in which form you're gonna invest the money in the startups. It could be equity shares, or it could be simply seed loan, or it could be simply a grant. So for which sort of companies we should invest the money, as a loan or equity, and what would be the criteria for the grant, all these things should be captured in the seed fund disbursement policy. The seed fund disbursement policy also covers the other important aspects like the valuation, how the equity shares of a private limited company will be valued if you want to invest some money as an equity investment. So all these things would be arrested in the seed fund disbursement policy. The other thing is HR manual. So this is good for the employees of the incubation center. So this HR manual is also a document which creates comprehensive, detailed rules and regulations for the employment of the company, of the incubation center. The other thing is that the purchase policies, which defines the sanctioning powers for the authorities for the purchases. And there should also be a travel policy for the employees of the company, because for financial and legal due diligences, I'm sorry. So for financial and legal due diligences, as per the requirement of the financial institutions and the funding agencies, and also as per the norms of the incubation center, the employees will be visiting different locations. So how would they claim the transportation cost? What would be the norms for the accommodation and all? So all these things would be captured in the travel policy. So these are some important registrations which should be done by the incubation center. The important thing is section 12AA under Income Tax Act. It is form 10. If the incubation center, if it is not a section 8 company, then there is a separate law. So you may discuss this with your professional, that if the incubation center, because incubation center was created to help the startups, and the main object of the incubation center is to provide assistance to the overall ecosystem of the startups. So this exemption certificate is very important, because you would be getting good amount of money from the funding agencies, and which you further subsequently disburse funds to the different startups. So even if you don't register your company under section 12AA, or if you don't file form 10 for your society under the Income Tax Act, there could be some issues in the income tax also, because you get amount of money from the funding agency, and by the end of the financial year, if you would not be able to close the fund disbursement to the startups, all these monies would be treated as revenues in your books of accounts. So you will have to apply for tax exemption certificate. And for this, you should consult with your CA or a company secretary who can be able to provide you assistance on the same. Section 80G also. And the other thing is Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. If the incubation center is willing to accept money from the foreign sources, it has to be registered under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, without which an incubation center cannot take grant from the foreign sources. So these are the basic points for due diligences, because once you incubate your startup in your incubation center, what would be the due diligence? The initial stage of cross-checking is very important. What we generally do, because every startup provides their unique idea, so it is also good for a legal team of an incubation center to carry very strong due diligence. So few important list is appended here, like the founder's background. Who are the founders? What are their backgrounds? If they are also the directors in other entities, please check the companies. What are their shareholding pattern in the private limited company? Sometimes we catch that a company is a subsidiary of a wholly owned if it is we have caught that many startups are wholly owned subsidiaries of a big corporate, of a big public limited company. So our focus should be to assist only a startup a private limited company. If a private limited company is a subsidiary of a public limited company, by default, that private limited company would be called as a public limited company, even though if it is if it is not a private limited company in the eyes of the law. But if it is a subsidiary of a public limited company, it shall be called as a public limited company. So the shareholding pattern is something very important. The financial background is also very important. Please check the balance sheet, the liabilities of a company from the liabilities and assets column of a financial statement of a company. Initial capital infused by the promoters, how much capital uh, has been invested by the promoters is also very important. Investment received by the company and its compliance, how much money the company has raised from external investments. If they have raised good amount of money from angel investor, that means the incubation center can rely on that company because they already have supporting hands from the angel investors. Directors qualification, it is also very important. Please check the MCA portal. Uh, Put that director identification number in the director master data, and you will see whether a director is actually qualified to become a director of the company or not. If it's not qualified, the MCA would flag it. The IPRs are also very important. If you are going to incubate any startup in your incubation center, please check the ownership of the intellectual property rights. If the founders don't carry the ownership in the IPRs, or they have taken a license for a few years, uh, how long the company is going to sustain is also a matter of discussion while making a strong due diligence. Coming to the next point is valuation by expert and registered valuers. So when you are going to invest some money, valuation is the most important point, very important point, because every startup estimates its own valuation, and generally the demand for the valuation is very high from the startup's point of view. So it is always relevant to have a clear picture of the valuation of the company. You may get the valuation done from your own independent valuers, or you may create some relevant grids. Basis of that, a valuation of a startup can be conducted. The other thing is collateral. The collateral is very important if you are thinking to invest money in any startup as a loan. Generally, startups don't carry the collaterals. They cannot provide you the documents, the ownership documents of the registration papers or the immovable properties, because they don't have all these assets. They have initially started a venture. They have initially created a private limited company, so they don't carry strong backup of the immovable properties. What they could provide is their own equity shares. So their equity shares could be placed as a collateral, or in some cases you may also go for a promoter's liability. But in the promoter's liability, they don't feel comfortability because they often say that only because of restricting the liabilities, they have created this private limited company. And if you are asking for a promoter's liability, they are not going to sign any loan agreement. So the last thing is the existing agreement signed by the companies, SHAs, term sheets. It is also very relevant. It is also very good to see the existing agreements which were entered by the startup with other government agencies and other parties, because only then you would be able to see that is there any restrictive clause in the agreement for the incubation or for availing any investment from the incubation center or any other agencies. If there is so, you may take a decision whether to incubate or not to incubate that company. So these are the very common and very important clauses for an incubation agreement. When you choose to incubate a startup, you should execute an incubation agreement with the startups, and that incubation agreement must comprise of all these important things, like the incubation period. What is going to be the incubation period? Maximum period of 3 years could be offered in a breakup of 1 year. What is going to be the consideration for the incubation? You may take some equity or revenue, or a combination of equity or revenue both from the startups. What is going to be the criteria for equity dilution? Generally, equities are allotted on a non-dilutable basis, but you may create some protective provisions for your equity shares, like the ratio between the promoters and the incubation center shall not be affected by the infusion of further funds by the promoters only. So these are this equity dilution clause is very important. You should discuss and go through the equity dilution clauses of other funding agencies too, and discuss this with your professionals also, that how should we go for a protective dilution clause in the incubation agreement. Proper share transfer. You should see whether the shares which you have taken in lieu of the incubation services um, has been properly transferred to your entity or not. Kindly check your documents, the transfer deed, whether you have got the share certificate um, uh, in the form of SH4 or not. Get it vetted by your chartered accountant at once, because your chartered accountant or a company secretary would give you a clear picture what is going to be the proper share transfer. So please uh, get your share transfer process vetted by your professional. Periodical reportings. Once your startup is incubated with your incubation center, you may create some important clause in your incubation center that they will have to submit different periodical reports, like progress reports, compliance reports. Like if you appoint some director, you will have to intimate to the incubation center and all. So these periodical reports, the norms for submission of the periodical reportings should be captured in the incubation center. The termination clause, under which sort of events the incubation center would be entitled to terminate the incubation agreement. This should also be captured in the agreement. Even if you may also create a clause in the incubation center that, notwithstanding anything written in the agreement, the incubation center shall be completely entitled to terminate the incubation agreement. So this would empower you to terminate the incubation agreement in between the incubation of a startup when you feel that termination is very important. Equity exit buyback or founder's mind. So this equity exit buyback provision is also very important in the incubation agreement, because the equity shares of a private limited company are not too marketable, because they get appreciation in the valuation only once they grow in terms of revenues and profits. So when they grow, when the businesses grow, the value of the equity also grows. So you should also think that beyond a period of certain time, say after 5 years or after 10 years, you should also be able to sell off your equity shares held in a startup. So there should be some clause or proviso in the incubation agreement that the company would be able, the company would make its best efforts to buy back your equity shares with the prevailing valuation norms. And what would be the valuation of the equity shares? All these terms should be captured in the equity exit provisions. And if a company receives any second round of investment, the company should be, the incubation center should be completely entitled to participate in that second round of investment, and could be able to sell its equity shares to the founders. Or if the equity buybacks or the equity exit does not successfully get closed, then the incubation center should be absolutely entitled to sell equity shares to any person, even to the competition also. So there should be no restriction on the share transfer. However, since it is a private limited company, it is not free. The shares of a private limited company, um, uh, these equity shares are not freely transferable. You will have to first offer the existing other shareholders the same value which you are getting from a third party. And if you don't get positive response from the existing shareholder, then only you would be able to sell your equity shares to the third party. So there is a restriction. However, it is good for the existing shareholders because private limited companies are generally created by the family members and all. So sometimes family members do not prefer for involving any third party or any external promoter or shareholder in the company. So that is why this clause is introduced in a private limited company concept. The other clause is confidentiality, because you are gonna help for R&D support and mentoring support. So all these information should be confidential, and all these information should be treated as a confidential information. Also, this provision should also be there in your incubation agreement. The dispute resolution service, what are the services and facilities that you are gonna give to the startup? This should be very clearly defined in the incubation agreement. And incubation charges. The last slide is for investment agreement. So I would request the members to kindly go through all these points, because investment is something very, very important in the core area of the incubation center, because you are going to use the money of the taxpayers of India. You are going to money of your own corpus. So while you make any investment, you should have a good investment agreement to be executed with the startup. So the first stage that you should first discuss and decide what is going to be the type of investment, whether it is going to be the equity investment or it is going to be the convertible preference shares. You should first make a decision for the type of investment that you are going to make in a startup. For equity, you should also decide that what is going to be the valuation of a startup. Uh, and if we talk about valuation, valuation may be called as an art, and it is not at all as a science, because if you value your startup from three different valuers, then you would get three different valuations at a huge difference amount. So that is an art. So valuing a company is something like going very deeply in the business activities of the companies, in the existing and projected revenues, in the projected profits and loss of the company, and coming up with the current and the future value of the company. And the combined value is basically called as the valuation, and which could be called as the value of the equity shares of the company. So it is always advisable to have a independent valuer, or what you can do in addition to getting a company valued by an independent valuer, the expert members of the incubation center, which carry some financial expertise, the legal expertise, they could create some grids, like for an initial stage startup uh, whose prototype is ready, but they have not launched their prototype in the market, and they have still not earned any amount of revenues or profits. You would be valuing that sort of corporate, that sort of startup within the ambit of 50 lakhs. I'm just giving an instance that how could you create these slabs for a startup which has started earning huge amount of profits, huge amount of revenues, uh, that might be valued, that could be valued for more than 10 cr. So these are the important grids that could be created after having deliberate discussions by the expert members, having financial knowledge and the legal knowledge of the valuation of the company. The convertibility criteria. So we are talking about convertibility criteria means uh, if if you are if you are observing that a company should be invested not with the equity shares but with the convertible preference shares. Convertible preference shares means the shares are of basically two types. Number one is equity shares, number two is the preference shares. So equity shares means uh, generally the equity shares, just so in between, I would like to invite the questions that I would like to answer. Yeah, Bhavya.
Yes, sir. So we have couple of questions from our participants.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So the first question is, being a society, can any incubator participate in tendering or bidding process?
Okay, I got that question. Being a society, can any incubator participate? So it depends upon the tendering documents and the bidding requirement. Sometimes, for example, IOCL has once started a program where there was a requirement that the incubation center has to be a Section 8 company. So there was a requirement. So it completely depends upon the mandate. So we will have to, a Section 8 company can definitely participate in any tendering or bidding process. There is no doubt about it. Absolutely, it can participate. However, the bidding documents and the mandate should also be checked. So is there any other question also?
Yes, sir. So next is a request. So can we highlight some inputs over SPV, SBU, and subsidiaries companies, its formation, and capital tax liability matters?
I would request you to please come again. I didn't listen to you actually.
So it is a request. Can we highlight some inputs over SPV, SBU, and subsidiaries companies, its formation, and capital tax liability matters?
ओके सो मैं अभी देख रहा हूँ कि किसी ने कमेंट किया है कि क्या हिंदी में भी बात कर सकते हैं,
हाँ
तो
जी।
हिंदी में भी हम बात कर लेते हैं. देयर इज अ रिक्वेस्ट फ्रॉम बुलंदशहर. सो देखिए, जो कैपिटल गेन टैक्स का जो मसला है वो बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट होता है. कैपिटल, पहले तो हमें ये समझना चाहिए कि कैपिटल गेन हमें टैक्स पे कब करना है. कैपिटल गेन टैक्स हमको पे करना होता है कैपिटल इन्फ्यूजन पे, जो भी गेन हमको कैपिटल में मिलता है. मतलब अगर हमने किसी कंपनी के इक्विटी शेयर्स खरीदे हैं, इसका मतलब हमने उसकी कैपिटल खरीदी है. और अगर हमने उस कैपिटल पे हमें कोई अतिरिक्त हमको कोई उसमें हमारी कुछ आय होती है, इनकम होती है, तो उस पे, उस गेन पर हमको उस पे टैक्स पे करना पड़ता है, कर पे करना पड़ता है. तो ये होता है कैपिटल गेन टैक्स. तो कैपिटल गेन टैक्स हमारे इंक्यूबेशन सेंटर में कब एप्लीकेबल होगा? वो कैपिटल गेन टैक्स हमारे इंक्यूबेशन सेंटर में एप्लीकेबल होगा शेयर ट्रांसफर पे. ये बहुत ही इम्पोर्टेंट टॉपिक है जिसको लेकर के बार बार चर्चाएं होती रही हैं कि कभी भी किसी भी स्टार्टअप कंपनी से जब आप शेयर्स खरीदते हैं, जनरली, हालांकि आप ये बोल सकते हैं कि सर हमको तो फ्री ऑफ कॉस्ट मिल रहे हैं, वो इंक्यूबेशन सर्विसेज के बदले में मिल रहे हैं. तो जो कैपिटल, जो भी आपको इक्विटी शेयर्स आपको बदले में एक्सचेंज में मिल रहे हैं, वो तो आप अपनी लैंग्वेज में बोल रहे हैं, लेकिन इनकम टैक्स ये मानता है कि आपने वो शेयर्स खरीदे हैं, किसी एक वैल्यू पे लिए होंगे, किसी एक मार्केट वैल्यू पे लिए होंगे. जैसे कि मान लीजिए उदाहरण के तौर पे, आज आपने किसी स्टार्टअप के शेयर्स आपको फ्री ऑफ कॉस्ट मिले. उस वक्त जब आपको ये शेयर्स फ्री ऑफ कॉस्ट मिले इंक्यूबेशन के बदले में, उस वक्त कंपनी के एक शेयर की वैल्यू 10 रुपया थी. और 5 साल के बाद मान लीजिए उसी कंपनी के पास एक बड़ा इन्वेस्टर आता है और बोलता है कि हम आपके शेयर्स में पैसा लगाना चाहते हैं और आपके जो दूसरे इन्वेस्टर्स हैं उनसे भी हम इक्विटी शेयर्स खरीद सकते हैं, और हम एक शेयर की वैल्यू 15,000 रुपये लगाएंगे. तो आप सोचिए, 10 रुपए का शेयर 15,000 में सेल आउट हो रहा है, यानी 14,990 रुपए पर शेयर का प्रॉफिट हो रहा है आपका इसमें. तो 14,990 रुपए पे सरकार बोलेगी, इनकम टैक्स डिपार्टमेंट बोलेगा, आपको जो ये प्रॉफिट हुआ उसमें आपको कैपिटल गेन टैक्स पे करना पड़ेगा. तो ये बहुत बड़ी प्रॉब्लम हो जाएगी. अगर मान लीजिए 20% कैपिटल गेन टैक्स पे करना पड़ गया और हमको 50 लाख रुपए मिल रहे हैं, तो 50 लाख का 20% हमको तो सिर्फ टैक्स पे करना पड़ जाएगा. तो हमको उसके लिए अच्छी टैक्स प्लानिंग करके चलनी चाहिए. टैक्स प्लानिंग का मतलब ये नहीं होता है टैक्स को चुराना. टैक्स प्लानिंग का मतलब ये होता है कि टैक्स को बचाना, कैसे टैक्स हम बचाएं. तो सबसे पहले तो मैंने इसीलिए बोला कि टैक्स एग्जेम्पशन सर्टिफिकेट बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट है किसी भी इंक्यूबेशन सेंटर के लिए, चाहे वो सोसाइटी हो, चाहे वो सेक्शन 8 कंपनी हो. तो आप अपने प्रोफेशनल से, चार्टर्ड अकाउंटेंट से बोलिए कि आप अपनी फर्म का एक टैक्स एग्जेम्पशन सर्टिफिकेट इनकम टैक्स डिपार्टमेंट से ले. प्रोसेस बहुत आसान हो गया है, सब कुछ ऑनलाइन है. अगर आप अभी भी, अगर आप नेक्स्ट फाइनेंशियल ईयर के लिए लेना चाहते हैं तो आप अभी भी अप्लाई कर सकते हैं. जुलाई तक प्रोविजनल सर्टिफिकेट ईमेल के जरिए इनकम टैक्स डिपार्टमेंट दे देता है. कोई भी किसी भी तरीके का इनकम टैक्स में अब करप्शन नहीं रह गया है. हो सकता है आपका प्रोफेशनल बोले कि आउट ऑफ पॉकेट एक्सपेंसेस इसमें करीब बहुत ज्यादा रहेंगे, तो उसकी बात पर विश्वास ना करें. प्रोसेस सब कुछ ऑनलाइन है। आज आप अप्लाई करिए। आपको डॉक्यूमेंट्स कौन से देने पड़ेंगे, उसके लिए आपको अपनी एक एक्टिविटी रिपोर्ट देनी होगी। आपको आपको जो चार्टर डॉक्यूमेंट है, आपका बाईलॉज है, वो देने पड़ेंगे और वहां पे आप अप्लाई कर सकते हैं। जैसे ही आपको ये टैक्स एग्जेम्पशन सर्टिफिकेट मिल जाता है, तो ये जो आपको कैपिटल गेन हो रहा है वो आपका टैक्स से बच जाएगा, सब्जेक्ट टू सम अदर प्रोविजंस ऑल्सो। लेकिन उसमें शर्त ही रहती है कि जो पैसा है वो आप इंक्यूबेशन सेंटर में ही आगे जाके वापस लगाएंगे। आप उसको बोनस के तौर पे बांट नहीं सकते उस पैसे को। इंक्यूबेशन सेंटर के ऑपरेटिंग कॉस्ट के लिए उस पैसे को आप यूज कर सकते हैं। तो ये मैंने कोशिश करी है, उम्मीद है कि आपको ये समझ में आया होगा। इसके अलावा किसी और का क्वेश्चन हो तो मुझसे प्लीज पूछ सकते हैं।
हाँ जी, थैंक यू सर। सर नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन है, कैन AOA एंड MOA लेटर बी चेंज एंड इट्स प्रोसेस?
देखिए, मुझे वो क्वेश्चन दिख नहीं रहा है इसमें।
सर AOA और MOA को
या,
हम
ठीक है, समझ गया।
यस सर।
तो आपका कहने का मतलब ये है कि क्या आर्टिकल्स ऑफ एसोसिएशन और मेमोरेंडम ऑफ एसोसिएशन बाद में चेंज हो सकता है? इसका जवाब है बिल्कुल हो सकता है। आपको उसकी जो प्रोविजंस हैं कंपनीज लॉ के, वो सेक्शन 14 और सेक्शन 13 पढ़ लीजिएगा। सेक्शन 14 में साफ तौर पे लिखा हुआ है कि किसी भी कंपनी का मेमोरेंडम ऑफ एसोसिएशन और आर्टिकल्स आप अगर अमेंड करना चाहते हैं, तो आपकी कंपनी के जो शेयर होल्डर्स हैं, जो सेक्शन 8 कंपनी होती है उनको उनमें शेयर होल्डर्स नहीं होते, उसमें मेंबर्स बोलते हैं शेयर होल्डर्स को। तो हम यहाँ पे बोलेंगे जो मेंबर्स हैं उनका हमें अप्रूवल चाहिए होता है। प्रोसेस बहुत आसान होता है, बोर्ड मीटिंग कराइए। बोर्ड मीटिंग में जो भी आपने मेमोरेंडम ऑफ एसोसिएशन और आर्टिकल्स ऑफ एसोसिएशन में आपने प्रपोजल दिया है उसको ऑल्टर करने का, वो आप उसको ऑल्टर करिए। और ऑल्टर करने के बाद फिर आप एक जनरल मीटिंग बुलाइए और जनरल मीटिंग में अपने मेंबर्स के सामने वो प्रपोजल रखिए, मेंबर से अप्रूवल कराइए। और जो भी रेजोल्यूशन पास हुआ है उसकी एक सर्टिफाइड कॉपी, और जो भी ऑल्टर्ड मेमोरेंडम ऑफ एसोसिएशन है और जो भी ऑल्टर्ड आर्टिकल्स ऑफ एसोसिएशन है, उसको सारे मेंबर्स से साइन करवाइए और उसको रजिस्ट्रार ऑफ कंपनीज में MGT 14 फॉर्म एक होता है, आप चाहे तो नोट कर सकते हैं, उसको वहां पे फाइल कर दीजिए। फीस बहुत ही कम होती है, हालांकि उस फॉर्म को सर्टिफाई कराना होता है किसी एक प्रोफेशनल चार्टर्ड अकाउंटेंट या कंपनी सेक्रेटरी से। उसको जब आप फाइल करेंगे तो रजिस्ट्रार ऑफ कंपनी उसको उसका निरीक्षण करेगा, इंस्पेक्शन करेगा और उस बेसिस में उसको वो एक्सेप्ट कर लेगा और अप्रूव कर देगा। अगर उसकी कोई क्वेरी होगी तो वो आपके पास ऑटोमेटिकली वो मेल भी उनकी तरफ से शूट आउट होती है, वो आ जाएगी और आप उसका जवाब दे सकते हैं। और जवाब देने के बाद अगर वो सेटिस्फाइड होगा तो आपके मेमोरेंडम ऑफ एसोसिएशन, आर्टिकल्स ऑफ एसोसिएशन को अप्रूव कर देगा चेंजेस। थैंक यू सो मच। इसके अलावा और कोई क्वेरी हो तो भाभी बताइए।
हाँ जी सर, नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन है, कंपनी अप्रूव्ड बाय गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया अंडर स्टार्टअप एंड DPIIT इज डिफरेंट?
देखिए, कंपनी अप्रूव्ड बाय गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया, एक बार आप फिर से बोलेंगे? एक बार फिर से बोलेंगे भाभी, आपने जो क्वेश्चन
यस
पूछा?
सर। सर, कंपनी अप्रूव्ड बाय गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया अंडर स्टार्टअप एंड DPIIT इज डिफरेंट?
देखिए, मैं आपके प्रश्न का ये मतलब नहीं समझ पा रहा हूँ कि कंपनी अप्रूव्ड बाय गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया। अगर आप इस वेबिनार में तो आप बोल सकते हैं।
यस सर, आई विल अलाउ।
तो मेरी रिक्वेस्ट है, अगर क्वेश्चन अगर आप थोड़ा सा और ब्रीफली बता दें तो, नहीं तो मैं आपको इसका उत्तर दे देता हूँ। अगर आप ये बोलना चाहते हैं कंपनी अप्रूव्ड बाय गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया, एक्चुअली में ऐसा कुछ नहीं होता है। जो कंपनी होती है उसका रजिस्ट्रेशन कौन अलाउ करता है? वो करता है मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ कॉर्पोरेट अफेयर्स। हाँ, आप बोल सकते हैं मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ कॉर्पोरेट अफेयर्स गवर्नमेंट का ही एक मिनिस्ट्री है। तो प्राइवेट लिमिटेड कंपनी जब आप बनाते हैं तो वो गवर्नमेंट की उसमें सहमति होती तभी वो बनती होगी। मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ कॉर्पोरेट अफेयर्स सरकार की ही एक मंत्रालय है। अब आप बोलेंगे कि वो जो हमने नॉर्मल कंपनी बनाई है वो और स्टार्टअप में क्या फर्क है? तो यस, बिल्कुल फर्क है। स्टार्टअप की डेफिनेशन मैंने आपको पीछे बताई। स्टार्टअप अलग अलग तरीके के हो सकते हैं। एक स्टार्टअप आपका प्राइवेट लिमिटेड कंपनी भी हो सकती है, और एक स्टार्टअप LLP भी हो सकती है, और एक स्टार्टअप आपका पार्टनरशिप फर्म भी हो सकता है। तो डेफिनेशन अगर आप DPIIT की देखेंगे तो स्टार्टअप की डेफिनेशन में 3 कैटेगरीज को रखा गया, पार्टनरशिप फर्म, LLP एंड अ प्राइवेट लिमिटेड कंपनी। तो डिपेंड करता है कि आपका कौन सा वेंचर है। अगर आपका स्टार्टअप प्राइवेट लिमिटेड कंपनी है तो आप पहले वहाँ पे DPIT के पोर्टल में जाइए, स्टार्टअप इंडिया का पोर्टल है, वहाँ पे आप लॉगिन आईडी बनाइए। लॉगिन आईडी बनाने के बाद आपको लॉगिन आईडी में जो आईडी रखनी है वो सिन होता है कंपनी का, वो रखिए और उसका पासवर्ड क्रिएट करिए। वहाँ पे आपको 7 से 8 क्वेश्चंस पूछे जाते हैं, वो आप फिल करिए, अपनी एक PPT डालिए उसमें, और उसके बाद जब आप उसको फाइल करेंगे तो 7 से 8 दिन के अंदर आपके पास वो रजिस्ट्रेशन DPIT रजिस्ट्रेशन सर्टिफिकेट आपके रजिस्टर्ड ईमेल आईडी पे आ जाता है। जब वो आपको सर्टिफिकेट मिल जाता है, जब वो कंपनी DPIT में रजिस्टर्ड हो जाती है, तभी आप बोल सकते हैं कि हाँ, हमारा DPIT रजिस्टर्ड फर्म है। तो ये मैंने कोशिश करी, उम्मीद है कि आपको इसका जवाब मिल गया होगा। थैंक यू सो मच।
Good afternoon, sir. Just a question. Actually, I've been muted. Sir, the same question you were telling about it. Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion is the organization which gives this certificate.
Yes, absolutely correct. So जो DPIT है वो आपका इसी डिपार्टमेंट के अंडर में आता है, बट भारत मंत्रालय ने करा क्या है, ये मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ कॉर्पोरेट अफेयर्स और DPIT को एक अलग पोर्टल बनाया गया है। आपने देखा होगा मतलब 2015 की गवर्नमेंट जब आई थी तो उन्होंने स्टार्टअप इंडिया का पोर्टल ही पूरा अलग करा। एक्चुअली में जो सर्टिफिकेट्स दिए जाते हैं वो इंडस्ट्रियल प्रमोशन के अंडर में ही दिए जाते हैं, बट देयर इज अ सेपरेट डिवीजन।
No, actually, sir, the company is already being registered under Startup India portal, and the certificate was got from the Department of Industry Policy and Promotion. But you are talking about DPPIT, so I thought there is some different organization which
is the same. So it is the same certificate. If you go through that certificate, there is a clear statement that the company is registered as a startup. So it is a valid conclusive evidence that your company is registered startup under DPIT.
Hope it is just clear. To add one, hope it is everything is clear. So just to add one small question in the part only. Sir, जो आपने बताया था कि AOA और MOA जब change होते हैं, तो in Section 8 company because you get a 12A certification also. Yes. So once you change that AOA and MOA, so does it defeat Section 12A also of the Section 8 company?
हाँ, बिल्कुल। देखिए, आपका क्वेश्चन बिल्कुल सही है। एक्चुअली मैं ये assumption लेके चल रहा था कि आपकी कंपनी ने अभी तक 12AA का रजिस्ट्रेशन नहीं कराया। एक बार आपने अगर 12AA का रजिस्ट्रेशन करा लिया, उसके बाद अगर आप कोई भी ऑल्टरेशन करते हैं तो बहुत ही सोच समझ के अपने प्रोफेशनल से डिस्कस करके ही करें। क्यों? क्योंकि आपको जो 12AA का रजिस्ट्रेशन सर्टिफिकेट मिलता है वो आपके प्रिविलिंग मेमोरेंडम ऑफ एसोसिएशन और आर्टिकल्स ऑफ एसोसिएशन के बेसिस में ही मिलता है। तो अगर आप कोई भी मेमोरेंडम ऑफ एसोसिएशन और आर्टिकल्स ऑफ एसोसिएशन में ऑल्टरेशन कराना चाहेंगे तो आपको पहले इनकम टैक्स डिपार्टमेंट में ऑल्टर्ड मेमोरेंडम ऑफ एसोसिएशन फाइल करना पड़ेगा। अगर वहां से आपने परमिशन नहीं ली है, तो मैं इसलिए बोल रहा हूँ कि अगर बिकॉज आपको जो सर्टिफिकेट उन्होंने दिया है उसमें भी आप अगर देखेंगे जाके, उसमें देयर इज अ क्लॉज व्हिच सेज which prescribe that the alteration should be approved by the income tax department also. तो अगर आपने इसका अप्रूवल इनकम टैक्स में आपने सोचा कि हमें मेमोरेंडम ऑल्टर कराना है, आपने करा दिया, लेकिन अगर आपने बिना अप्रूवल के आपने इनकम टैक्स से ऑल्टरेशन कराया है तो आपका जो इनकम टैक्स सर्टिफिकेट है वो भी रिवोक किया जा सकता है। तो बी वेरी केयरफुल ऑन दैट सेस।
थैंक यू सर।
और भी कोई क्वेश्चन अगर है तो आई वुड बी फ्री टू।
जी, थैंक यू मिस्टर आदित्य। सो नेक्स्ट आई रिक्वेस्ट मिस्टर ईश्वर चंद फ्रॉम बुलंदशहर टू प्लीज आस्क योर क्वेश्चंस।
जी बोलिए।
हेलो।
या आप आपकी आवाज में सुन पा रहा हूँ बहुत अच्छे से।
हाँ सर, मैं ईश्वर चंद बोल रहा हूँ बुलंदशहर से। सर, ये किसानों के लिए स्टार्टअप बनाने के लिए बुलंदशहर के आसपास कोई भी इंक्यूबेटर सेंटर अभी काम नहीं कर रहा है, तो बुलंदशहर के किसी के लिए कहाँ संपर्क करें अभी?
देखिए, इसके लिए मेरा आपको सजेशन रहेगा कि हमारे ही इंक्यूबेशन सेंटर में बहुत ही एक्सपीरियंस्ड प्रोग्राम मैनेजर्स हैं। मैं रिक्वेस्ट करूंगा भाव्या से कि आपको कनेक्ट कराएं उन प्रोग्राम मैनेजर से, जिनका एक का नाम तो राहुल पटेल है और दूसरा और भी सुधा जी हैं। आप एक बार इनसे भी जरूर सलाह मशवरा ले लें इसके बारे में, बिकॉज दे आर एक्सपर्टाइज, दे होल्ड एक्सपीरियंस इन द सेम फील्ड। वैसे मैं बता दूं कि जो एग्रीकल्चर फील्ड है, एग्रीकल्चर फील्ड पे गवर्नमेंट की बहुत सारी स्कीम्स आ रही हैं और बहुत सारे इंक्यूबेशन प्रोग्राम्स आ रहे हैं, और ना केवल गवर्नमेंट के बल्कि प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टर्स भी इस फील्ड पर आ रहे हैं, जो कि जो स्टार्टअप्स एग्रीकल्चर फील्ड पर है और उनके पास कोई इनोवेटिव आइडिया है प्रोडक्टिविटी बढ़ाने के लिए। फॉर एग्जांपल ऑर्गेनिक फार्मिंग एक नया एक फील्ड उभर के सामने आ रहा है। ऑर्गेनिक फार्मिंग में जो भी इन्वॉल्व स्टार्टअप्स है उनको कई बड़े इन्वेस्टर्स फंड कर रहे हैं, जिसमें कि टाटा ट्रस्ट भी इन्वॉल्व है, सिटी बैंक भी इन्वॉल्व है, HDFC बैंक और ICICI बैंक भी इन्वॉल्व है। तो बट चूंकि ये इंडस्ट्री से रिलेटेड आपका क्वेश्चन है, मैं अभी आपको तो इतना ही उत्तर दे सकता हूँ। और बट आप इसके बारे में एग्रीकल्चर से संबंधित अगर आपको कोई और अच्छी जानकारी चाहिए तो हम बहुत खुश होंगे आपकी मदद करने के लिए। और हमारे यहाँ सुधा जी और राहुल जी से आपको मैं भाव्या आपसे रिक्वेस्ट
हाँ
करूंगा
जी
कि
सर।
आप जरूर कनेक्ट कराएं इनको।
हाँ
उम्मीद है
जी।
कि मैं आपकी थोड़ी मदद कर सका इसका जवाब देने में।
थैंक यू सर।
जी जी, और किस आप आई वुड बी हैप्पी अगर आप और प्रश्न पूछते हैं तो मैं जवाब देने।
सर प्रश्न
Sir, a
ये
question I
कि
have
मुझे
asked
एक
actually.
जी जी, मैं एक एक करके आप आइए तो मैं ब्रीफ में थोड़ा सा डिस्कस करना चाहूंगा। जी बोलिए।
Can I ask the question or?
या yes sir,
Sir,
please.
actually, I have asked one question. You have given that reply, but that question was different.
Yeah.
So my question was like, sir, there is a SPV and a SBU, a new concept for the big multinational companies being forming right now. So
Yeah.
whenever they make some virture or some acquisition or they need try to do something with some startups, so they create a SPV or something of SBU. So
Correct.
क्या ये चीजें क्या लीगल एंटिटीज होती हैं या सर जैसे
हाँ,
और
देखिए,
आज की डेट में
हाँ
अगर
बहुत
उसमें
अच्छा
SBU
क्वेश्चन।
में कुछ शेयर्स लेना?
नहीं देखिए, ये मैं आपको सही बताऊं, मेरा एक्सपीरियंस है, स्ट्रेटेजिक बिजनेस यूनिट की बात कर रहे हैं। क्या है कि स्ट्रेटेजिक बिजनेस यूनिट इटसेल्फ कोई लीगल एंटिटी नहीं रखता है अपने में। आप मेरी बात समझिएगा, स्ट्रेटेजिक बिजनेस यूनिट क्या है कि आपने नई कंपनी नहीं खोली, आपने क्या किया, अपनी ही कंपनी में दो अलग अलग डिपार्टमेंट या बोल सकते हैं यूनिट बना दिए। जैसे मान लीजिए मैं आपको बताऊं कि मैं उस कंपनी का नाम कॉन्फिडेंशियलिटी की वजह से नहीं बता सकता हूं, कि ये कंपनी है जो डेंगू की दवाइयों पे काम कर रही है, और उसी कंपनी ने एक कोई मेडिकल का एक बिल्कुल दूसरा डिवाइस तैयार किया। उसके पास जो इन्वेस्टर्स आ रहे हैं, दो अलग अलग तरीके के इन्वेस्टर्स आ रहे हैं। एक इन्वेस्टर आ रहा है डेंगू की जो उन्होंने दवाई बनाई है उसके लिए इन्वेस्टमेंट करना चाह रहा है, और एक इन्वेस्टर आ रहा है जो दूसरे सेगमेंट पे वो काम कर रहे हैं उसके लिए वो इन्वेस्ट करना चाह रहे हैं। और इसी तरीके से यानी कि दो अलग अलग यूनिट के लिए ना केवल इन्वेस्टर्स आ रहे हैं बल्कि मेंटोर्स भी आ रहे हैं, काउंसलर्स भी आ रहे हैं, अलग अलग फंड्स भी आ रहे हैं। तो इन्वेस्टर की वहां पे एक रिक्वायरमेंट हुई कि साहब हम चाहते हैं कि आप अपनी एक और कंपनी खोल लें, जिसको कि आप बोल सकते हैं SPV, स्पेशल पर्पस व्हीकल। स्पेशल पर्पस व्हीकल आप खोल लें डेंगू के लिए, वो आपकी सब्सिडरी कंपनी रहेगी, और आपकी जो मेन कंपनी, इसको आप एक काम करिए, इसको आप दूसरे बिजनेस यूनिट में चलाते रहिए। तो उसमें प्रॉब्लम क्या है कि जो एंटरप्रेन्योर है, देखिए वो उसके पास इतने फंड्स नहीं रहते मैनेज करने के लिए। तो कहेगा साहब हमें दो कंपनी खोलनी पड़ेंगी, एक कंपनी हम खोलेंगे जो स्पेसिफिकली SPV के तौर पे काम करेगी डेंगू यूनिट के लिए, और दूसरी काम करेगी दूसरे सेगमेंट के लिए। बट अभी पिछले 3-4 साल से ये स्ट्रेटेजिक बिजनेस यूनिट का कॉन्सेप्ट है वो नया निकल करके आया है। इसमें क्या होता है कि एक बोर्ड मीटिंग कराई जाती है, बिकॉज मैंने उसका काम किया है, आई हैव एक्सपीरियंस दैट थिंग, आई हैव ड्राफ्टेड डॉक्यूमेंट्स ऑल्सो। उसमें 2 सेपरेट एसबीओज बनाए जाते हैं। तो आप अपनी कंपनी में 2 बोर्ड ऑफ डायरेक्टर्स तो रख नहीं सकते, 2 बोर्ड तो रख नहीं सकते, बट आप 2 काउंसिल क्रिएट कर सकते हैं, जिसको आप बोर्ड ऑफ गवर्नर्स भी बोल सकते हैं, या सेपरेट मेंटर बिजनेस बोर्ड ऑफ एडवाइजर्स भी बोल सकते हैं। वो रिपोर्ट आपको बोर्ड को करेंगे, और दोनों बोर्ड ऑफ एडवाइजर्स 2 अलग अलग वेंचर्स को रेगुलेट करेंगे। लेकिन बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट चीज ये है कि आपको बहुत सारे डॉक्यूमेंट्स इसमें तैयार करने पड़ेंगे, जैसे कि आपका जो बुक्स ऑफ अकाउंट्स हैं, कंपनी लॉ बोलता है कि आपके जो बुक्स ऑफ अकाउंट्स हैं वो कंसोलिडेटेड बन, उनको मतलब नहीं है कि आपके पास 2 यूनिट्स हैं तो आप 2 यूनिट्स के अलग अलग प्रॉफिट एंड लॉस एंड बैलेंस शीट बनाएंगे। वो चाहेंगे क्या, मतलब देयर इज अ स्टैट्यूटरी रिक्वायरमेंट कि आपकी जो बैलेंस शीट है वो एक ही होगी। वो अलग अलग आप चाहें तो बैलेंस शीट में दिखा दीजिए कि हमारा एक इस एसबीओ से इतना पैसा है, एसबीओ 2 से इतना पैसा है, लेकिन जब आपकी बैलेंस शीट बनेगी तो वो कंसोलिडेटेड ही बनेगी। तो एसबीओ वाला जो कॉन्सेप्ट है वो अच्छा कॉन्सेप्ट है। अगर आपके पास कोई इन्वेस्टमेंट आ रहा है और आप चाहते हैं कि हम इस तरीके से काम करें, तो बिल्कुल उस पर काम किया जा सकता है। लेकिन एसबीओ, क्या एसबीओ खुद एक सेपरेट लीगल एंटिटी है या नहीं है, तो इसका मेरा आंसर ये रहेगा कि एसबीओ नहीं है, बल्कि जो एसबीओ का जो होस्ट इंस्टीट्यूशन है, जिसको आप बोल सकते हैं, जिसके अंडर में वो एसबीओ बनाया गया जो कंपनी है, वो आपकी लीगल एंटिटी के तौर पे पहचानी जाएगी। अगर मान लीजिए टाटा मोटर्स का एक एसबीओ उन्होंने बनाया है जो सिर्फ पैसेंजर्स व्हीकल क्रिएट करते हैं, और एक व्हीकल उन्होंने बनाया है जो जो आपके प्राइवेट व्हीकल्स बनाते हैं, कॉमर्शियल व्हीकल्स नहीं बनाते, देयर आर 2 एसबीओ। लेकिन अगर हमें टाटा मोटर्स के ऊपर मुकदमा करना है, कोई सूट फाइल करना है, तो हम एसबीओ के अगेंस्ट में ना करके हम टाटा मोटर्स के अगेंस्ट पे करेंगे, क्योंकि लीगल एंटिटी हमारे लिए टाटा मोटर्स रहेगी। आई होप कि मैंने आपको कोशिश सही करी बताने
सर
की, इसके अलावा कोई क्वेश्चन हो रही है?
सर इसमें एक छोटा सा था, I think so I'll connect more with you offline, but still it can be a good for the everybody also, sir. Sir, for example, if SBO is created, so who will, sir, like there are 2 companies coming, जैसे आपने मेडिकल डिवाइस का एक एग्जांपल बताया, तो मेडिकल डिवाइसेस लेने के लिए मैंने प्लांट एंड मशीनरी खरीदी। अब प्लांट एंड मशीनरी मेरी 100 रुपए की है, 50 रुपए कोई बाहर की कंपनी लेकर आ रही, 50 रुपए मैंने मिला है, तो उसमें डिप्रिसिएशन कौन क्लेम करेगा?
देखिए, फिर वही बात है कि जो ये रूल्स एंड रेगुलेशंस होते हैं, वो एसबीओ के हिसाब से नहीं चलेंगे। आपकी जो मेन कंपनी का जो रूल है, जैसे मान लीजिए कंप्यूटर्स हैं, अपने कंप्यूटर्स पे 100% डेप्रिसिएशन खत्म हो जाता है 2-3 साल में। आई एम नॉट एक्सपर्ट इन फाइनेंस, तो जो आपके डेप्रिसिएशंस हैं, जो भी आपके लॉज हैं, वो प्रिवील वही करेंगे जो कंपनी लॉ या इनकम टैक्स बोलता है। अगर मान लीजिए कोई फॉरेन फंड से आपने कोई मशीनरी खरीदी है, तो आप ये मत सोचिए, या आप ऐसा नहीं कर सकते हैं कि जैसे कि मैंने जिस कंपनी में भी यही चीज बोली थी, जिसका मैंने एसपीओस क्रिएट किए थे थोड़े दिन पहले, कि आपके साथ उसके डेप्रिसिएशन के जो रूल्स रहेंगे वो अमेरिका के हिसाब से रहेंगे, और यहाँ पे जो रहेंगे वो इंडिया के हिसाब से रहेंगे। आपके जो कंपनीज एक्ट के जो इंडियन स्टैंडर्ड्स हैं, जो जो आईसीएआई ने जो बनाए हैं, वो रूल्स एंड रेगुलेशंस ही आपको फॉलो करने पड़ेंगे। और डिटेल में अगर आपको जाना है तो आप मुझसे ऑफलाइन कनेक्ट कर सकते हैं, वहां से आपको नंबर मेरा मिल जाएगा।
थैंक यू सर।
हाँ जी सर, नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन के लिए मैं ईश्वर चंद सर से रिक्वेस्ट करूंगी।
जी जी। मैं ईश्वर चंद जी से गुजारिश करूंगा कि आप अपना क्वेश्चन रखें हमारे सामने।
I think sir he is not present, so we can take the next question from Gwalior.
What is that?
Yes sir. So sir, next question is, being a society, can any incubator participate in tendering or bidding process?
या मैंने इसका जवाब दे दिया। IITM ग्वालियर, आपका कहने का मतलब यही होगा कि आपके पास यू डोंट हैव, if you feel that I should speak in Hindi, please clearly communicate this. So if you think that if you are a society, if you are not a Section 8 company, then you can still participate in any bidding or a tendering process. So if you are a society registered under the Society Act, you are an artificial person, and you also enjoy the benefits of an artificial person. However, the SAP legal entity mechanism is not there. The members, as like in other private limited companies. So my answer would be that you can still participate in any bidding or a tendering process, even if you are a society. However, you need to check the bid documents also and the mandate also. Sometimes
There is some network connection from Yogi sir end. Please wait a minute. हाँ जी सर, योगी सर ज्वाइन कर रहे हैं.
Yeah, I'm really sorry because of the network issue I got disconnected. तो I hope मेरा आपको आंसर मिल गया होगा कि even if you are a society, you can still apply for a tendering process, but you will have to read out the bid documents very carefully and also the eligibility norms for the person applying for the bid. Thank you so much. Any other question? Bhavit, आपके पास क्या? Did you get any other question?
जी
अच्छा, I'm really sorry, आपकी voice crack कर रही है. आप तो अपना क्वेश्चन आप टाइप कर सकते हैं chat में.
ठीक है सर, ठीक है, ओके सर.
सो आपका प्रश्न मैं देख रहा हूँ जो आपने लिखा है, मेरा स्टार्टअप अभी रजिस्टर्ड नहीं है. तो अभी आपको अगर अपना स्टार्टअप रजिस्टर कराना है DPIT में, तो मेरी आपको सलाह रहेगी, प्रैक्टिकल सलाह रहेगी, क्योंकि मैं अगर आपसे बोलूँगा कि आप स्टार्टअप इंडिया का पोर्टल खोलिए और वहाँ पे आप रजिस्टर करना शुरू कर दीजिए, तो आपको थोड़ा सा समझने में दिक्कत होगी. तो आप YouTube में जा कर के प्रोसेस देख सकते हैं कि स्टार्टअप इंडिया पोर्टल में आप कैसे रजिस्टर कर सकते हैं. उसमें पूरा प्रोसेस, बहुत सारे वीडियोस हैं. इजी तरीका मैं आपको बता दे रहा हूँ. आपको यूट्यूब में तो हालांकि पता चल ही जाएगा कि आपको सबसे पहले मेक इन इंडिया, स्टार्टअप इंडिया वाला जो पोर्टल है, बैकग्राउंड बिल्कुल स्टार्टअप पोर्टल पर रजिस्टर है. सर, मेरा स्टार्टअप अभी रजिस्टर नहीं है, स्टार्टअप पोर्टल पर रजिस्टर है. देखिए, मैं आप ये कहना चाह रहे हैं क्या कि मेरा स्टार्टअप DPIT में स्टार्टअप पोर्टल पर रजिस्टर है, फिर आप कौन सा रजिस्ट्रेशन की बात कर रहे हैं?
सर कंपनी रजिस्टर्ड नहीं है, मतलब मैंने वो नाम रखा है और कंपनी का और वहाँ रजिस्टर्ड कर लिया है सर जैसे तैसे, लेकिन कंपनी रजिस्टर्ड नहीं है और फील्ड में भी काम नहीं है अभी कुछ। तो मतलब कंपनी बनाने में सरकारी योजना का लाभ कैसे मिलेगा? जैसे निधि प्रयास योजना है शायद कोई सर, उसमें मतलब प्रोटोटाइप कुछ कई तरह की चीज होती है, उन्हें विकसित करने के लिए, आइडिया पे काम करने के लिए मदद मिलती है।
अच्छा, अब आपकी आवाज आ रही है, सो थैंक यू टू द इंटरनेट कनेक्टिविटी ऑल्सो। तो देखिए, ये जो आपका प्रश्न है ना, कंपनी रजिस्टर नहीं है तो आपने रजिस्ट्रेशन स्टार्टअप में कैसे कराया है? मुझे लगता है कि आपने अपने नाम से कराया होगा, इंडिविजुअल नेम से कराया होगा, या आपने पार्टनरशिप फॉर्म का कराया होगा। कंपनी रजिस्टर नहीं है तो आप सबसे पहले तो वहाँ पे अपने आसपास देखिए कि कोई प्रोफेशनल कंपनी सेक्रेटरी या चार्टर्ड अकाउंटेंट है या नहीं है, उससे आप संपर्क करिए। हम लोगों से भी आप बात कर सकते हैं। कंपनी रजिस्टर कराने के लिए आपको जो मैंने तरीके बताए हैं, आप अपनी एक कंपनी बना सकते हैं, जिसके लिए आप अपने प्रोफेशनल को बताइए कि हमारा ऑब्जेक्ट ये रहेगा कंपनी का। चलिए, ये सब तो बहुत ही आसान बातें हैं, ये तो कोई भी सीएस आपका कर देगा। कंपनी बनाने का खर्चा 12 से 13 हज़ार रुपये का रहता है। आपका ये जो दूसरी स्कीम के बारे में आप बता रहे हैं, इस स्कीम के बारे में मेरे पास अभी कोई ट्रैकिंग इंफॉर्मेशन नहीं है, तो अभी तो मैं आपको कोई कॉन्क्रीट आंसर इसका मुझे नहीं लगता है वुड बी एबल टू गिव यू। मे बी भाव्या may connect with some other mentors of SIC and come back to you on this. आप स्कीम का नाम टाइप कर दीजिएगा इसमें। भाव्या, आप नोट डाउन कर लेंगे प्लीज इफ यू कैन।
हाँ जी सर।
जी
ठीक है सर, ठीक है।
Sir, now I request Mr. Mahendra sir to have a question.
जी जी
Mahendra sir, can you hear us? I request Mr. Ishwar sir to please mute. Okay, so I think Mahendra sir is busy in another meeting. So sir, now we can continue the presentation.
yeah, sure, thank you. So I should just move to the next slide. So ये मैंने आपको इन्वेस्टमेंट के एग्रीमेंट के कुछ प्रोविजंस बताए थे। आई थिंक ये कंप्लीट हो चुके हैं। तो मैं जब लोन एग्रीमेंट की बात करूं तो इंक्यूबेशन सेंटर में अगर लोन एग्रीमेंट आप ड्राफ्ट कर रहे हैं तो सबसे इम्पोर्टेंट होता है कि आपको लोन का जो एग्रीमेंट है उसमें लोन का जो अमाउंट है वो कितना रहेगा, कितना ब्याज आप अपने स्टार्टअप से लेंगे। आप अपने इंक्यूबेशन सेंटर में एक प्रोसेस बना सकते हैं, एक स्टैंडर्ड रेट्स भी बना सकते हैं कि बिकॉज अलग अलग स्टार्टअप से अलग अलग इंटरेस्ट रेट्स लेने से फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी ट्रांसपेरेंसी में क्वेश्चंस उठते हैं कि आपने एक स्टार्टअप को 8% पे ब्याज पे लोन दिया, एक स्टार्टअप को 10% पे दिया, एक को 11% पे दिया। तो टू अवॉइड ऑल दीज सिनेरियोज इट इज ऑलवेज गुड टू हैव अ स्टैंडर्ड पॉलिसी फॉर द इंटरेस्ट रेट्स कि हम SBI PLR रेट्स पे ही आपको ब्याज पे हम आपको देंगे, या RBI पे दे RBI रेपो रेट पे दे सकते हैं। जैसे कि RBI रेपो रेट अभी 4% ब्याज 4% है, तो उनका स्लैब्स होते हैं अलग अलग पीरियड के बेसिस में कि मान लीजिए 6 महीने का है तो आपने निकाल लिया SBI PLR रेट 6 महीने का क्या है, तो प्राइम लेंडिंग रेट में आपको अगर दिख रहा है 7% तो +1 भी कर सकते हैं या +2 भी कर सकते हैं। जो भी पॉलिसीज आप बनाना चाहें वो बना सकते हैं कि सो इट डिपेंड्स अपॉन द PLR रेट्स कि कैसे उसको करना है। इंटरेस्ट में आपने अगर स्टैंडर्ड पॉलिसी बना ली तो स्टार्टअप्स जनरली मार्केट से लोन उठा नहीं पाते हैं क्योंकि उनको बैंक लोन देता नहीं है। और अगर लोन देता भी है तो वो हैवी अमाउंट ऑफ मॉर्गेज और प्लेज और ये आपका कोलेट्रल मांगता है, जो कि उनके पास होता नहीं है। तो मजबूरी में वो जो उनके पेरेंट्स होते हैं, अगर वो फाइनेंशियली बहुत स्ट्रांग हैं तो वो मदद कर भी देते हैं फैक्ट्री का या कोई भी पेपर रख के, लेकिन वो जनरली हो नहीं पाता है। तो जो उनके पास सपोर्ट होता है वो सीड लोन का रहता है। इक्विटी में जो हम नुकसान तो नहीं बोलेंगे, लेकिन इक्विटी में एक ड्रॉबैक है, डिसएडवांटेज है कि इक्विटी शेयर में पैसा अगर आपने किसी कंपनी में इन्वेस्ट कर दिया तो आप कंपनी को फोर्स नहीं कर सकते हो कि आप पैसा हमारा वापस करिए। हालांकि बायबैक के प्रोविजंस, एग्जिट के प्रोविजंस रहते हैं। जब कंपनी के पास आगे आने वाले समय में पैसा आता है तो आपके इक्विटी शेयर्स को डिस्पोज ऑफ करता है, सेल आउट करता है, या आप इन्वेस्टर को शेयर सेल आउट करते हैं। उस तरीके से आप वहां से इन्वेस्टमेंट उठा सकते हैं। लेकिन आप अपने मतलब जब आप इक्विटी को डिस्पोज ऑफ कराते हैं तो आपको पैसा आपका वापस मिल जाता है, बल्कि उसके अलावा वैल्यू एडेड अमाउंट भी मिलता है अच्छा खासा, जिसके बारे में भी हम लोग बात करते हैं, कैपिटल गेन टैक्सेस के बारे में। अब अगर हम लोन एग्रीमेंट की बात करें तो लोन में एक सबसे बड़ा फायदा ये भी रहता है इनक्यूबेटर्स को कि वो जो पैसा आपने एज अ लोन दिया है ऐसे स्टार्टअप को जिसको मार्केट में कोई लोन नहीं दे रहा था, और वो धीरे धीरे वायबल होने लगा उसका बिजनेस, रेवेन्यूज आने लगे और उसने इंस्टॉलमेंट्स में आपको लोन चुका दिया, तो दे आर लीगली दे हैव अ लीगल बाइंडिंग विद यू। आपके साथ एक लीगल अनुबंध होता है कि आपको इतना लोन हमें वापस ही करना है। अगर वो लोन वापस नहीं करते हैं तो आप उनके ऊपर कानूनी कार्रवाई भी कर सकते हैं। हालांकि गवर्नमेंट के अगर फंड्स आप स्टार्टअप्स को दे रहे हैं तो कानूनी कार्रवाई के लिए तो आप एग्रीमेंट में अनुबंध करा सकते हैं, लेकिन जनरली अवॉइड करते हैं, क्योंकि स्टार्टअप्स अगर फेल हो गए तो आप क्या उनके ऊपर कार्रवाई करेंगे अगर स्टार्टअप एग्जिस्ट नहीं कर रहा है तो। लेकिन वो उनके अंदर एक ये लीगल बाइंडिंग रहती है कि हमें ये पैसा वापस करना, और उसका एक सक्सेसफुल स्टार्टअप हमेशा ये कोशिश करेगा कि हमारा जो डेट रेशियो है वो कम से कम हो, और उसी तरीके से जैसे जैसे डेट उसका कम होता जाता है प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी बढ़ती जाती है उसकी, और दूसरे इन्वेस्टर्स होते हैं उनका विश्वास भी कंपनी में बढ़ता है, इसलिए हमेशा वो लोन अपना कम करते चले जाएंगे। मैं एग्जांपल के तौर पे मैं बार बार टाटा का नाम इसलिए ले रहा हूँ क्योंकि बहुत अच्छी तरीके से स्टडी कर रहा हूँ आजकल की टाटा मोटर्स अगर आप देखेंगे बहुत ही नामी गिरामी नाम है, लेकिन पिछले 4 साल में 3 साल में टाटा मोटर्स जो है वो लॉस पे जा रही है। लेकिन टाटा मोटर्स इस टाइम कर क्या रहा है, वो अपना लॉसेस को कम करता जा रहा है 3 साल से। तो मार्केट में जो उसकी शेयर वैल्यू वो भी बढ़ रही है, इन्वेस्टमेंट्स भी आ रहे हैं कि इनके लोन्स कम होते जा रहे हैं, और आने वाले 2 सालों में उनका टारगेट है कि हम लोन खत्म कर देंगे। तो कर्जा अगर लाइफ में ना रहो तो यू विल हैव मोर कंफर्टेबिलिटी। सेम इज एप्लीकेबल फॉर अ स्टार्टअप ऑल्सो, कि अगर आपको आपकी जो देनदारियां हैं वो कम, जो आपके लोन्स हैं वो कम है, तो आपके लिए आगे जाके बिजनेस को आगे बढ़ाने में बहुत फायदा होता है। तो इसी तरीके से कोलेटरल में अगर आपको लेना है उनसे, बिकॉज आप उनसे कोई प्रॉपर्टी तो कोलेटरल में रखवाएंगे नहीं, तो आप उनसे इक्विटी शेयर्स वगैरह ले सकते हैं, प्रोमोटर्स की गारंटी ले सकते हैं। हालांकि प्रोमोटर की गारंटी कोई देता नहीं है, क्योंकि उनका कहना है कि सर हम लोगों ने कंपनी किस लिए खोली, अगर आपको गारंटी ही लेनी है, क्योंकि प्राइवेट लिमिटेड कंपनी में ऐसा कोई गारंटी वर्ड नहीं होता है। तो उसके लिए आपके ऊपर है, अगर आपको लग रहा है कि जो प्रोमोटर्स हैं उनका बैकग्राउंड बहुत स्ट्रांग है और आपको डाउट हो रहा है कि कहीं ऐसा ना हो कि मेरे पैसे का मिस यूटिलाइजेशन हो जाए, पैसा वापस ना मिले, लेकिन प्रोमोटर्स का जो बैकग्राउंड बहुत स्ट्रांग है, तो आप एक क्लॉज लगा सकते हैं कि प्रोमोटर इन केस अगर कंपनी पैसा नहीं देती तो प्रोमोटर्स को पर्सनली पे करना पड़ेगा। लेकिन ऐसा बहुत कम होता है, इसके परसेंटेजेस बहुत कम है। उसके बाद आता है वर्क ऑर्डर बेस्ड फंडिंग फॉर द वर्किंग कैपिटल। कभी कभी स्टार्टअप्स के साथ क्या होता है कि गवर्नमेंट की अलग अलग स्कीम चलती हैं, जैसे अभी डिफेंस में चल रही है, आपने देखा होगा, और भी बहुत सारे प्रोग्राम चल रहे हैं कि आपको स्टार्टअप्स को अपॉर्चुनिटीज दी जाती हैं। इवन इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चरल सर्विसेज में भी, रेलवेज में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर के लिए टेंडर आएंगे तो स्टार्टअप्स के लिए अलग से रिजर्वेशन रखा जाता है। तो आपको मिल गया वहां से वर्क ऑर्डर, और वर्क ऑर्डर में आपने देखा कि मेरा इनिशियल कैपिटल जो इन्फ्यूज करना है मुझे, वो 25 लाख रुपए करना है। 6 महीने के अंदर मुझे माल बना के तैयार करना है और 6 महीने में 25 लाख रुपए का अरेंजमेंट करना है। तो इनक्यूबेटर के पास अगर फंड्स हैं, कॉर्पस फंड अपना है, या अलग अलग प्रोग्राम चलते हैं उसके द्वारा इनक्यूबेटर ने अपने फंड्स जुटा के रखे हैं, तो वहां पे भी इनक्यूबेटर का दायित्व होता है कि वो ऐसे स्टार्टअप्स की मदद करे। तो वो आप वर्क ऑर्डर बेस्ड फंडिंग इसको बोलेंगे कि आपने वर्क ऑर्डर का प्रॉपर निरीक्षण कर लिया, इंस्पेक्शन कर लिया, ड्यू डिलिजेंस कर लिया, साइट विजिट भी कर ली, और आपने प्लेज भी क्रिएट कर लिया कि जो भी आप स्टॉक क्रिएट करोगे, फ्लोटिंग प्लेज उसको बोलते हैं, वो हमारे फेवर पे आप क्रिएट करेंगे, और उस बेसिस में आपने उनको फंडिंग दे दी, पैसा दे दिया। और जब उनका वर्क ऑर्डर का काम पूरा हो गया, उन्होंने माल बना लिया, बेच दिया, पैसा आ गया, वो आपको वापस कर देंगे। उसमें आप 10% या 12% का जो भी आपका स्टैंडर्ड रेट का है वो आप इंटरेस्ट भी ले सकते हैं। फिजिकल साइट विजिट फॉर डीडी बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट होती है। स्टार्टअप्स अगर आपको वर्क ऑर्डर दिखा रहे हैं तो थोड़ा सा, अगर आपको ऐसा लगता है, इट इज ऑलवेज रेलिवेंट टू विजिट द फिजिकल साइट ऑफ द कंपनी। बजटेड एक्सपेंसेस, एक्सपेंडिचर्स एंड माइलस्टोन्स, ये बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट है। जब आप किसी फर्म को या स्टार्टअप को लोन दे रहे हैं तो आप पहले से ही उनसे पूछिए कि आपके माइलस्टोन्स क्या रहेंगे, टारगेट्स क्या रहेंगे, आप क्या करेंगे इस पैसे का। बोलेगा सर मैं इस पैसे को सबसे पहले तो मैं एक्टिविटी नंबर 1 करूंगा, फिर एक्टिविटी नंबर 2 करूंगा, एक्टिविटी नंबर 3 करूंगा, तो आप मुझे तीनों एक्टिविटी का पैसा एडवांस में दे दीजिए। तो यहाँ पे एडवाइजेबल ये रहता है कि आप उनको तीनों एक्टिविटी के लिए पैसा ना दें एक साथ। आप उनसे बोलिए ठीक है, पहले एक्टिविटी 1 के लिए पैसा ले लो, जब तुम्हारी एक्टिविटी 1 कंप्लीट हो जाए उसके बाद आप हमसे दूसरी एक्टिविटी के लिए पैसा लेना, जब तुम्हारी एक्टिविटी 2 कंप्लीट हो जाए तो आप एक्टिविटी 3 के लिए पैसा ले लेना। और साथ ही साथ आप इसमें ये भी कर सकते हैं कि जो आखिरी वाली जो इंस्टॉलमेंट है, आप वो रिम्बर्समेंट बेसिस में भी आप उनको लोन दे सकते हैं, कि आपके जितने भी इन्वॉइसेस हैं जब आपके पास सबमिट हो जाए तो आप उन इन्वॉइसेस को आप रिम्बर्स भी कर सकते हैं। तो इस बेसिस में ये आपका चलता रहता है। मतलब इस तरीके से दिस इज द प्रोसेस दैट द लोन्स आर डिस्बर्स्ड टू द स्टार्टअप्स। एंड लोन कन्वर्टेबल टू इक्विटी, ये भी एक प्रोविजन आप रख सकते हैं कि बहुत सारे स्टार्टअप्स हैं जो कोशिश करते हैं कि लोन का पैसा हम अभी ना चुकाएं, पैसा है फिर भी नहीं पे कर रहे हैं, रिपे नहीं कर रहे हैं। तो आप एक मैंडेट लगा सकते हैं कि साहब अगर आपने 3 साल के अंदर लोन पे नहीं किया तो सारा एक लोन जो है वो इक्विटी में कन्वर्ट हो जाएगा। तो वो स्टार्टअप्स को आपको डायरेक्शन देना, इक्विटी में कन्वर्ट करना है। और आप सोचिए उस पर अगर स्टार्टअप्स का अच्छा वैल्यूएशन है और आपका अच्छा अमाउंट ऑफ लोन है, दैट लोन वुड बी कन्वर्टेड इनटू इक्विटी शेयर्स। तो जो एग्जिस्टिंग इन्वेस्टर्स हैं उनको बुरा लगेगा, तो वहां पे वो स्टार्टअप्स को दे वुड बी कंपेल्ड टू एक्सपेडाइट, दे वुड बी कंपेल्ड टू repay the loan amount, either to repay the amount or to convert the money into the equity shares. And the last है expenditures not permitted. ये एक्सपेंडिचर्स आप एग्रीमेंट में लिख सकते हैं कि भैया आपको हम ये लोन दे रहे हैं, इन लोन का पैसा आप यहाँ पे जगह खर्च नहीं करेंगे। जैसे कि आप बोल सकते हैं कि प्रोमोटर्स अपनी सैलरी नहीं उठाएंगे। मैंने एक्सपीरियंस किया है कि हम लोगों ने एक स्टार्टअप को 25 लाख रुपए दिए, 50 लाख रुपए दिए, और जब हम लोगों ने इनसे यूटिलाइजेशन सर्टिफिकेट मांगा तो 25 लाख रुपए का तो डायरेक्टर ने सैलरी दिखा दी उन्होंने। तो वो एक तरीके से आप बोल सकते हैं कि मिसयूटिलाइजेशन हो गया पैसे का। या डायरेक्टर सैलरी का भी है तो ठीक है, वो इफ दे वांट टू टेक द मनी, बट इट इज ऑलवेज गुड दैट मनी शुड बी यूज्ड ओनली फॉर द बिजनेस ऑब्जेक्ट्स एंड नॉट फॉर द पेमेंट ऑफ द सैलरीज टू द प्रोमोटर्स। और दूसरा ऑब्जेक्ट होता है कि आप कोई दूसरा लोन रिपे करने के लिए हमसे लोन ना लें। तो these are some important discussions which you should think. So thank you so much. This PPT is closed. I think the slides are done.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Yogi sir, to have such a great, valuable and knowledge sharing session on legal aspects and funding aspects that are important for an incubator.
Thank you so much, and it was really a great session, and I really enjoyed, and I wish all the very best. My apologies, अगर जवाब ना दो तो.
Thank you, sir. And I also really appreciate to all our participants from TIDE centers for their sincere participation throughout all the 3 sessions. I welcome all of them to have a meeting on 10th March on the physical event. So thank you everyone for attending the session. Thank you.